Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson at the University of Illinois State Water Survey and the private well class. And welcome to our webinar about is your water safe to drink? Common questions about private wells. And so today's webinar is really just answering questions that we've received. Some we get every webinar, so we try to cover some of the basics about sampling and things like that. Then towards the end, we'll get to the questions that you all asked, although we'll answer some of those as well during the first part of the presentation. So if you are a licensed sanitarian, environmental health professional through NEHA, this webinar is available for CEU credit. And you can see here, their credentialing cycle is 2 years. And so the example I used in the second bullet there is that if you take this webinar to do this webinar today, you can count it as part of the 2-year cycle. If it ends 6/30/19, you can take it again next month. But other than that, if your credentialing cycle started June 1st this year, you won't be able to take this again for 2 years. And so over on the bottom right, we've listed the past webinars that are within 2 years of today, just so you understand that. And it's also available for LEHP credit in Illinois. We're a licensed provider. And so this information is available. I will say that Katie Buckley, who handles all our CEU work, is on vacation until next Thursday, so there may be a delay in getting back to you if you want that information. But it's also on your GoToWebinar screen or pop-up. There is a handouts tab, and the handouts for today are there for everyone. So with that, I'm Steve Wilson. As I mentioned, I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the State Water Survey. I have with me Dan Webb and Jennifer Wilson. Jennifer is a drinking water specialist who's part of our private well program, and Dan is also part of our program as well, but he's also the manager of the public service lab for the water survey, where our public service lab does water sampling for residents in Illinois. Until 2006 or 8, somewhere back there, it was a free service to any well owner in Illinois, which was awesome. And now there's a nominal fee, but it's still subsidized by the state, which is great for the folks in Illinois as far as sampling for inorganics and metals. And so Dan is on today. He'll be participating at the end with the questions to answer those that are more related to his field of expertise. I'm not a chemist or a lab person, and so though sometimes I try to pretend to be. So, and Jennifer is going to monitor the questions on the GoToWebinar tab. There is a question and a chat tab, or you have one of the or the other. And if something comes up today during the webinar that you want to ask a question, ask it there, and she will make a list of those, and we'll get to those at the very end. All right, so with that, this is part of a national program. The private well class is funded through RCAP and US EPA, and we're going on, I believe, our 6th year. And so these materials follow what's a free well owner course that we developed at privatewellclass.org. This is not the course. These webinars are meant to supplement that material. But if you are especially a new well owner or don't know a lot about your well, we certainly recommend the first thing you do is take our class. It's free and it's self-paced. So it sends you a PDF once a week for 10 weeks, and it walks you through what it means to be a well owner and what kind of support you have, what information you need to know, all those things. And so this entire program, the point here is it's funded by RCAP, Rural Community Assistance Partnership, who's a nonprofit and also part of our program, which I'll get into in a minute, as well as with funding from US EPA. So the RCAP network, the reason they're important is they're a technical assistance and training provider, a nonprofit. Their national office is in DC, but they're really a partnership of 6 nonprofit organizations that all do technical assistance training and education for both private well owners and rural and small water and wastewater communities, at least in the drinking water realm. So each of these RCAP regions, which I'm in Illinois, so we're part of Great Lakes RCAP, which their office is based in Ohio, but they have staff in every state. They're the boots on the ground part of the private well program that we run together. So there's a person at Great Lakes RCAP who covers all the Great Lakes states, and she goes around and does what I'm going to bring up in a second, well assessments, puts on workshops, is a resource on the ground who can help well owners in each of those areas. And each of the regions have one full-time person, in some cases 2 or 3, who are working on these issues, private well issues, and can be a support for you, especially, they can support you as say a county or a local health department or another entity where a well owner may have questions for you that you can't answer. You can lean on those folks to help find those answers for you. So a great example is the state of Rhode Island. Their Department of Health doesn't have the staff to go out and investigate every private well issue. And when they get more troubling type questions that are a health risk, they'll call the RCAP Solutions folks, and they'll go out and do an assessment and try to help evaluate what might be the cause or what can be fixed or whatever. And that's all free of charge because of the grant that we're being funded under. So it's really a great service. And I mentioned the assessment. There is an 8-page assessment tool that an RCAP person or someone who has enough well experience to really fill this out. I think there are 18 sections. This is just the first page, but it asks about water use, piping in your home, the type of geology. They try to find a well log if there is one. All this information that they then can hand back to the well owner and say, here's what we know about your well and your situation and the type of geology you have. And so here's the things you need to be concerned about, and here's some best practices that you should follow. So it's really meant to be a one-on-one opportunity for a well owner to learn more about their well specifically. What I can tell you from doing this for 30 years is that almost every well is different in some way. Either the material that's stored nearby, the location, the type of well, how it's been rigged up. Sometimes it's been, it's not following code or whatever because they just want it to work. And so all of those things come into play, and I'm certainly showing enough pictures today and examples of some of those cases where they're a unique situation. What the assessment does is like a sanitary survey. For those of you who are professionals who work with small communities, the Safe Drinking Water Act requires a sanitary survey every 3 years of a community drinking water system. So this is really meant to be like a sanitary survey for a private well, but it's voluntary, and there's no ramifications for doing this other than you learn more about your well. So it's an opportunity to teach well owners about the vulnerabilities they may have and what things they maybe want to fix if they need to and all that sort of thing. But it's also a chance to promote best practices, and also it gives the well owner the opportunity to ask questions about, who locally should I talk to? And, in some states there's more activity related to private wells than in other states. And so it really depends on where you live, what resources might be available to you. So as far as this program goes, they've done over 1,800 assessments around the country so far. We've also held over 50 workshops around the country for sanitarians and trained professionals to teach them how to use the assessment tool. And so, the goal is that we have one consistent tool around the country that folks are using to try to assess what's going on with people's wells, and it's relatable. And again, it's all free. And so we have a number of county health departments and local health departments that have went through our class. And I will mention, which I forgot to put on the slide, it's a 4-hour workshop, and we're actually hosting this next week as an online class. And so if you are an environmental health professional or interested in using the assessment tool as to support well owners, again, this really isn't for a well owner to use themselves. You can email us about that or look online under our webinars and you'll see when that is. So, and part of the goal of that is also to develop partnerships and make everyone more aware of the resources that are available to private well owners. So it's a good program. So the water survey where I work is at the University of Illinois, where all 3 of us work. And most people, even in Illinois, don't know who we are. So I put a couple slides in here just to explain the history of the water survey. Every state has a state geological survey, Illinois also has a sister agency, the State Water Survey. I'm in the groundwater section. We have a watershed science section and a chemistry section and atmospheric sciences. And so we do applied research and provide support for well owners and communities in Illinois related to their water issues, both groundwater and surface water. But the survey was originally formed as an organization to go out and investigate why there were so many cholera and typhoid outbreaks around the state. And so it was meant to document the water quality in Illinois, and that became the basis for the water survey we know today, which has over 140 employees, I believe. And we do things from, we house the state's well logs, we have a public service lab. We also do a lot of applied research to help communities with their water quantity and quality issues in Illinois and around the country. So it's a great opportunity for me. I've worked here my entire career to learn a lot about groundwater, wells, all the issues that communities and private well owners have. And we get calls nearly every day from well owners asking questions here in Illinois alone. So as an example, going through our well records, we have community records that describe not only their well logs and what their water system's like, but anything we've done in the past to work with them. And this was in the PAINA file, one of our staff came across from 1916. And the quick story here is that in 1916, there was a typhoid outbreak in PAINA. It's in South Central Illinois. These are all the homes where they had an outbreak. And in the end, it was traced to the PAINA Ice Cream Company. And so you can see they had 2 locations there on the map, but it's this kind of information, doing this type of investigation and support of communities in Illinois that the Water Survey is known for. So as far as if you're a well owner, here's the things that you really need to understand. So I grew up on a private well, just to be clear, an old dug well, matter of fact. Private wells are not regulated in the country per se. Once they've been installed, there are certainly rules on how they're constructed and how they're finished and grout and all those things. But once a well's installed, there's no regulations that I know of for private wells, other than if you sell your property in a few states. So they're not regulated. Once you have a well, it's up to you as the owner to be sure the water's safe. You're really the operator of a very small system, and you can't go by taste, odor, or color. That's the message here. Many contaminants that are naturally occurring, even arsenic, have no color, taste, or odor. You're not going to know you have arsenic in your water if you're basing it on those things. So that's why you need to test. And so I now live in Champaign-Urbana area. We're under a community water supply that has about 150,000 residents total. And so I pay 40 to 50, sometimes in the summer 60 or $70 a month. And that's the cost for all the residents that they pay, so that we have pressure at our taps every time we turn them on. We know the water's safe because they're testing it. And we know we're always going to have water because they're maintaining the infrastructure to get the water from the wells that are 4 to 6 miles outside of town into town through the treatment plant, so that the water I have is safe and tastes good and always has pressure. And as a well owner, all those things are your responsibility. And that's that's the message. If you are a well owner and you're using your water for your drinking water supply, or even if not, you're using it for any purpose, it's important that you maintain it and put resources toward it, especially learn as much as you can about your well and the geology and those things. And that's the message you'll hear a lot today from me, so that you understand what's going on whenever you have a problem, or if there's a change in your well in some way, or a taste and odor, you know what to do. So it's really about being aware. As a well owner, you should know your well log. You should find it. If you don't have it, you can talk to your state resource agency that licenses drillers, or requires certain well construction code. In Minnesota, that's the Department of Health. In Wisconsin, it's DNR. In Washington State, it's the Department of Ecology. And so you can Google that just by saying, Missouri well logs, and the links all come up for Missouri DNR, because they house the well logs for the state there. And so you want to try to find your log and understand the geology there. You can go to your state geological survey, or even probably your county health department or local health department. And if they can't answer your question, they can send you to someone who can, to understand those things, because depth of your well, your pump setting, whether you have a screen or not, how much casing you have, all those things are important, which you'll hear again and again today too, regarding how protected your well is from surface contamination and other things. You should also know that in many parts of the country, there are naturally occurring contaminants: radon, uranium, arsenic, and I'll show you some examples of that. So you need to know whether those things occur in your area. Again, your state resource agency or your state geological survey, and maybe your local health department will know. I know, like in Tazewell County, Illinois, there's some areas where the Muhammad Aquifer has high arsenic. If you call Tazewell County Health Department, they're very aware of that issue. They work with well owners all the time because of it. It's naturally occurring, and they're your best source if you live there. And the whole point about the program we have and the class that we provide is that it helps you learn to ask the right questions and where to find local sources of information. So, and the last piece, which, goes without saying, yet nearly 2/3, or in some places more than 2/3 of people have never sampled their well, is you need to sample your well regularly. And we'll go through the details of that too. Okay, so always a lot of questions about testing. How do I collect a sample? What should I test for? How often? Where do I get it analyzed? All those things. And so we're going to run through that part of it first. And so where do I collect the sample? Well, usually you want to take a drinking water sample, and that's the water coming out of your kitchen sink. So that's typically where you're getting your water for cooking and all those things. But you need to understand that the water at your kitchen sink may be different from the water at an outside tap, especially if the outside tap isn't connected to any kind of treatment you may have, like a softener or a filter, and it hasn't ran through possibly copper or lead pipes or some of those things. So what our lab does, what Dan does, is we ask well owners when they call us for samples, what their situation is, if they have treatment, how old's their home, and then we send them 2, sometimes even 3 sets of sample bottles and ask them to collect those in all those different places. And what you find is, that's important to me as a groundwater researcher, because I want to know the groundwater quality, not necessarily just the drinking water quality, but also what's the quality of the water in the ground. That's important to you as a homeowner, because if you have to add treatment or need to add treatment for whatever, even to soften your water, knowing the raw water versus your water through your softener and at your kitchen sink, if they're different, helps a treatment professional understand what they need to add and what issues you might have. So when you contact a lab, they should give you detailed instructions on collecting the sample and where to do that, and depending on what you're looking for. So what do you test for? Well, it really depends on a lot of things. Where your location is, if you have known contaminants. If your well's shallow, then it's more likely, especially if it's an old dug well that maybe doesn't meet current construction code, then you have issues there with bacteria that may be more prevalent. And so you should ask your county or local health department for advice, and they will know if there's any kind of local natural contaminant or any issue in your area. You can also talk to other folks, your state records folks, your neighbors, driller, co-op extension. Some states have really robust cooperative extension programs where they're probably the go-to in the state for information about private wells. And an example of that would be Pennsylvania, where Penn State Cooperative Extension has had a really strong presence in the state helping well owners. And part of the problem there is that Pennsylvania doesn't license drillers, and they don't require, they don't have a well construction code, which makes it more of a challenge there, because anyone can drill a well and they don't have to use proper construction techniques. That doesn't happen that often, but and the residents there have done a lot to circumvent that issue. But co-op extension is really another good source of information. So when you test, one thing is you sample for coliform and nitrate annually. They indicate a pathway into your well. What that means is, nitrate at a high level is an issue for pregnant women and babies under, say, 1 or 2. Sorry about that. And coliform bacteria is an indicator. So, coliform itself doesn't necessarily cause health problems, but it's an indicator that coliform can get into your well, and coliform only exists through human and animal waste, so mostly. And so if they're in your well, that means there's a pathway into your well. And so they're easy to identify and fairly cheap to sample for. And so that's one way to know if your well may have a construction or a sealing issue, or possibly there's a source nearby, like a septic or animal facility that your well is susceptible to. So, and that's why you recommend doing that every year. So I got my slides out of order a little bit. One of the things we talked about 2 slides ago was what to sample for. And I show this picture of Rhode Island because this is on their website. And the little dots that are all over here are where there used to be orchards. And back in the day, arsenic was heavily used as a pesticide at orchards. And what they found is every one of these have soil contamination with arsenic, some very severe, and it does leach down into the groundwater in some cases. So if you're near an old orchard, which they've identified through GIS mapping, then they're telling the residents there that you probably need to sample for arsenic and make sure your well's safe. And this is unusual because in most of the country where there is arsenic, it's naturally occurring. It's just part of the mineralogy of the earth. I believe arsenic is the 7th most common element in the Earth's crust, and so it's just there. But and then the big splotch in the middle, which is why I highlight this particular map, is where there's high beryllium. And I found this probably 5 or 6 years ago on their website. And until then, I did not realize that beryllium was even a regulated contaminant. But under the Safe Drinking Water Act, beryllium it has health effects, detrimental health effects. And so community water supplies are required to test for it to make sure that it's not a problem. And so, we've never had that issue that I know of in Illinois. And it's just why you need to contact other folks and find out what the issues might be, because you never know where there might be another patch of beryllium because of the way the mineralogy and geology are in that area. It's just kind of surprising stuff. And as we move on, as we move forward in time with now the capabilities we have online, we're starting to see more states or even local health districts put materials online that support well owners as far as understanding what their risks might be. So the state of Massachusetts has provided this website where you can type in your address and it'll tell you your probability of whether you should be concerned or not for arsenic or uranium. And if so, then they're recommending you test. And it really depends on where you live. It's not everywhere. And this is how they've chosen to provide this information to their citizens in their state. And again, now Wisconsin DNR has put together a more robust database of information that's interactive. So I clicked on arsenic by county and I get this map, and it shows me the green areas mean all the water samples they've done are less than 5 micrograms per liter, which is the health standard for community water supplies is 10 micrograms per liter, or ppb. And you can see near the Green Bay area, for those 3 counties in red, the average is over 21, which means if you live in one of those counties or near there, you may want to consider sampling for arsenic because it's more prevalent there. And that's probably a geologic issue, and it's just in the groundwater and the makeup of the earth material there. So more and more of these tools are going to become available. We know that several states, I believe Louisiana being one, they're developing some of these GIS tools. And so that's just, it's great information to have as you want to understand what your risks might be being a private well owner. And you can see that most of the state is fine as far as arsenic goes. And the counties that are clear outlined, that means that they had no samples. Not that there were none detected, like the very northern county there by Duluth, where there was no arsenic encountered in the county in the samples they have. So interesting. So here's what we suggest. And again, you have to remember this is a national program, and we're giving advice to well owners all over the country. So we've kind of created a basic list, if you will, of the things you should do for testing. So as we mentioned before, coliform and nitrate annually, they indicate a pathway into your well. And so if you have either of those that have nitrate at elevated level, or you have coliform, then there's a reason why, and you need to figure out why. It could be that someone worked on your well, pulled the pump, and what we recommend is anytime the well cap's opened, you should disinfect, and maybe they didn't do that, or they didn't do a good job disinfecting, and it led to that happening. Or maybe your well cap isn't sealed properly like it used to be. It's older, the gasket's worn and brittle now instead of working like it's supposed to, or the vent tube has lost its screen and bugs have gotten in there. There's a lot of reasons, but you need to figure that out. So, and also then if you've never sampled your well for any of these other things, here's a list that we provide. And the idea here is this gives you a general chemistry of your water, like knowing the pH, and if you have galvanized piping, or copper, if you have copper piping, because if you're seeing a lot of copper in a sample, that means the water's probably a little bit aggressive or corrosive, and it's starting to eat into your copper pipes, which copper is a regulated contaminant. And if it's an older home where the copper pipes may have lead solder, it's likely, if the water is aggressive like that, that it's also leaching lead. So it's a matter of just understanding. And if you take this to a qualified health professional, your results, they should be able to help you understand what all those results mean. And that's the next step. So I want to show an example here of someone who submitted their water sample to our lab, to Dan's lab. And I'm going to show 3 samples. This was done in 1915. The first one is from an outside spigot. So this is their natural water quality. And if you look on the left near the top, you can see iron's at 2.99 milligrams per liter, which is pretty high. Sodium's at 25.9. And then on the right, you'll see in the middle there that it's got pretty high turbidity and color because it's groundwater, and it's not, it's not that uncommon. The pH is 8, and down below that it shows the hardness is 351. Okay, so that's the raw water. So he let this tap run outside for a little bit so that he's getting groundwater, and this is what the natural groundwater quality is. So then he has a filter and a softener, and after running it through the filter and the softener, you can see how the chemistry's changed. Now the sodium's 198 instead of 25.9, I think that's what it was. And that's because you're using softener salt, which it's replacing the hardness, but it also is increasing the amount of sodium that is in your water. So if you're on a low sodium diet, it may be something to be aware of. And if you look down at the bottom right where the hardness is, now that's down from 351 to 0.68. So their softener is doing a great job. And you can also see the turbidity and color have gone down a lot. The pH changed a little bit, but not really. And so now their water quality is certainly different than from the outside tap. Now, this person also has an RO unit on their kitchen sink. And so after it's ran through their RO unit, which takes out almost everything, you can see that most of these less than symbols, the arrows going to the left, mean it's below detection for the equipment in our lab. And so most things are below detection. It did increase boron, which I think is typical for an RO unit. And the other thing I wanted to point out is the pH changed from 8 to 6.23. So the things in the water that help buffer it and raise the pH are now gone. And so the water pH now is 6.23. And below 7, water's a little acidic, which in some cases makes it corrosive or aggressive. And that's not such a big deal here in Illinois, where our pH is usually above 7.5 to start with. But in some areas of the country, the natural water quality may have a pH of 5 or 6. And so an RO unit's going to probably make it a little more corrosive than it already is. And so it's just those types of things that you need to be aware of. You can never have too much information. I went to this person's house to do a well assessment, and they had this data that I didn't even know existed. And I've used it ever since for these presentations because it's an example of what one homeowner chose to do for themselves and what they figured out by doing so. Where should you test your well or when? In addition to what we've mentioned already, anytime the well's been opened, anytime you disinfected it, you should follow up with a sample, at least for coliform, to be sure the well is safe to drink, which you disinfected it in the first place because it likely had bacteria in it from a previous sample. And if there's any kind of emergency response event like a flood or a fire, this is a picture of a melted well cap and melted wiring from Jefferson County, Colorado. Their county health department provided us with some pictures after a forest fire there. And we have short videos that explain what folks should do if they're in an area where they might be susceptible to a fire, and what to do to their well before they leave their home if they are in the path of a fire. And the same way with flooding. There's a lot of work being done on emergency response because of the number of hurricanes we've had over the last 3 or 4 years. And we've worked a lot with folks in Texas and Florida, and Virginia Tech did a great project with both those states through extension to sample wells after the hurricanes that were there in 2017. And so understanding that once your well's been overtopped by water, you probably need to disinfect it, and you shouldn't drink it or you should boil it until you have. All those things are just information you should understand as a well owner. So about getting it analyzed, our bottom line recommendation for people around the country, again, we need to come up with a generic statement that's consistent, is that every state accredits labs. They have a state accreditation program through US EPA so that communities can get their water samples tested for compliance to the Safe Drinking Water Act. And many of those labs also will test private well samples, and so we recommend using one of those. And you can go to your state primacy agency to find out what the labs are in your state. You can also go to US EPA's website and Google on their website, or put in the search box certified labs, and you'll get a map that you can click on your state and find those. Some programs, or some states also have programs for testing of their own. And the big thing is a good lab will give you detailed instructions, be able to explain what you're doing and why, tell you how you should keep the sample, how soon it needs to be back, all those things. They should be able to answer all of your questions. And if they can't, you should find a different lab, because labs should understand what they're providing to a well owner. It shouldn't be they're just giving you a result and leaving you on your own. And so that's what we recommend, and that's also what we tell labs. You need to have someone at your lab who understands private wells and the issues they have, and can help well owners understand what they really need to test for. And so I'd find a good lab. And I do want to mention our lab used to be accredited, but it just became not cost effective for us. And so now our lab does sampling. We follow the EPA's recommendations and all the methods and procedures, but we're not actually accredited. We're a university lab that's more of a way to identify if there's a problem or not, where then if you wanted to take a sample to a certified lab later, you can. There are a number of labs like this around the country, Texas A&M, Virginia Tech, where it's just, the cost. We're not a commercial lab. We're not trying to make money. And so it just isn't cost effective to meet all the requirements for reporting and everything else. So, I trust our lab and the other university labs, and I do want to mention that. But, our recommendation would be to go to a certified lab, or accredited lab. As far as interpreting the results, the bottom line here is you should take it to your local health department to get a qualified answer from a health professional. They're the best folks to tell you whether the drinking water from your well has a health risk and what you should do about that. There are websites and documents online that provide support to well owners. And, I'm going to show one of those in a minute. But again, even if you use one of those sites, the best thing to do is to take it to a local health professional who, that's their job. I know we had a well owner ask a question about they were going to have surgery, and they felt they were going to be compromised when they came home. And so they wanted to know what they should test in their well to be sure they would be okay at drinking the water. I certainly am not qualified to answer that question. So I sent an email out to 6 or 8 folks who I do feel are qualified. And every one of them responded that they should talk to their doctor, that only their doctor should be giving them that advice, their surgeon or their primary care physician. And so, I'm sure some of that is to do with legal issues and stuff, but it, just speaks to you need to go to the right professional to do the right thing. So, so other points here, if you do find something in your well, sometimes, especially if it's really high or really out of character for the area, and you take it to the health department, and they're like, wow, we don't have any of this problem anywhere else. Maybe resample to confirm. Labs do make mistakes. Sometimes samples get fouled, things like that. So, and if you do have bacteria and you've only tested for coliform, then I would go back and do an E. coli test. E. coli is a health risk. And until you've determined why and can fix that issue and disinfect your well, you should boil the water you're using for drinking and cooking. So this is the site I mentioned. There are a number of sites. Several extension programs also have websites where you can enter data from your sample, and it'll tell you whether it's a risk or not. But the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, with funding from CDC, a few years ago developed this well-informed guide. And so it's really, it's the best one out there, in my opinion, because it does a couple things better and differently than some of the other tools that are online. So with this, this is really built for the citizens of New Hampshire, but anyone can use it. It's freely available. And so a number of states are using this code and developing their own. We expect in a few years to see a number of states that have the same type of opportunity for their citizens in their states. So if you click on the green box where it says enter your water test results down at the bottom, you can go in and put in a value. One of the first things that I notice and what's important as a well owner to you is, sometimes labs report things in different units, and that can be confusing. Milligrams per liter is ppm and micrograms per liter is ppb. And for instance, we ask a question on our pre-test and post-test that's also voluntary as part of our class for people to convert from one to the other. And many of the other websites ask you to convert to a standard unit like milligrams per liter. Well, if they report it in micrograms per liter, are you able to convert to milligrams? And when we asked that question, we've had, 3,000 or 4,000 people do our pre-test and post-test. Only 27% got that right. They actually converted that number correctly. So it is an issue. And just like me, once I got out of college, I don't do a lot of math. And so, remembering all those things isn't necessarily easy for anyone. And this website has a drop down. You click on the drop down, you put in the units that are listed on the lab report, and it's going to be one of those four for arsenic. It's going to be micrograms per liter, milligrams per liter, ppm or ppb. And, in this case, I put in 15 micrograms per liter, which the standard is 10 for community water supplies. So when I click submit for those results, it comes back with a red X and says it's over the standard. 15 micrograms per liter is equal to 0.015 milligrams per liter, which the health standard is 0.01 or 10 micrograms per liter. So the other advantage of this particular website, in addition, it's ran by a state agency, so that to me gives it a lot of credibility, is that it lists at the bottom what types of treatment you might want to use. So for arsenic, there's really these two. There's point of use absorptive media, and there's point of use reverse osmosis. So that gives you information if you talk to a treatment professional, so that you don't need, water softener isn't necessarily going to help, or some other device isn't necessarily the way to go. It's one of these two. And I will mention that the last lesson in our class, lesson 10, talks all about treatment, types of treatment, what it can be used for, how to protect yourself from buying equipment you don't need, and also where to find information on equipment that's certified to actually remove the contaminants that it says it will. So all of those are important factors in dealing with treating your water. Further down the list, it also has, it talks about, so I mentioned certified equipment. Down at the bottom here, it says treatment options. Number one, NSF ANSI Standard 53 is for absorptive media, and NSF ANSI standard 58 is for point of use reverse osmosis. So if you go to a website for a treatment company and want to buy an RO unit, make sure if you're trying to remove arsenic that it says it's certified under standard ANSI standard 58 to remove arsenic. That means it's been tested by a third party and it actually takes out arsenic to a level that's safe based on all the testing they've done. And so there are third-party certifiers, the National Sanitation Foundation, Underwriters Labs. You see UL symbols on all kinds of equipment, and also the Water Quality Association has a gold seal program that's similar. And so, again, this is to protect you and make sure that you're doing things that are going to actually work for you and your system. So I want to re-mention that these tools are really only a guide, for typical water. Sometimes you can find really strange things in groundwater because of local geology that may not exist in other places, kind of like the beryllium. And in some cases, more organic matter may have an effect, and it may be better to use one or the other. Or like for arsenic, for instance, there's two forms of arsenic. There's arsenic +3 and arsenic +5. One of those, both of those types of treatment will remove. The other one, and I can't tell you which offhand, only an RO won't take it out. And so those are important things to know before you go buy an RO unit and then test your water and it's still got arsenic in it. So take them to a health department. They can do some follow-up, even tell you who to talk to. Sometimes they may have a treatment professional that they rely on that they can send you to, things like that. So the health professionals at local health districts, their job is to make sure they're trying to help you and protect you. There's only a few places in the country, and I only know of a couple local health districts in Massachusetts where this is the case, where if your water sample has a contaminant at a high level, they can ask you not to drink the water. In every place else in the country, like in Illinois and almost every other state, they can recommend you don't drink the water. Like our health department would tell you in Tazewell County, if your arsenic's at 200 ppb, which is true, it happens, it's probably best that you don't drink this water. And sometimes they get a response. My grandpa lived to be 86 and he drank this water his whole life, and they just basically blow it off. That's their choice because they're not being regulated, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense. You want to protect your family and any friends or kids from any of those risks. So yeah, that's all I'll say about that. So as far as poor construction, that's the other big issue. To me, there's really two things. One is well owners aren't educated like they should be to understand the risks and all the requirements of being a good steward of their well and their water supply. And the other is we have a lot of wells that are grandfathered in. So even though we have construction code, like in Illinois, construction code was first passed in 1968, but it's been edited and changed dozens of times as we learn more and as technology changes and all those things. But all those old wells are still grandfathered in. They don't make people re-drill their well because it doesn't meet the current code. So we still have wells in pits, which was done before pitless adapters were available so that well pipes wouldn't freeze. And we still have hand dug wells that are still in use. I mentioned I grew up on an old hand dug well. My grandpa hand dug our well in 1933. It's uncemented brick. It's in a ravine so that so it'd always be full. And it's only 14 feet deep. So what happens when I was growing up is we have a big rainstorm, our water was cloudy for a couple days. During the summer, if I left the hose on in our livestock tank, we may be without water for several days. And then when we got water, it was all muddy and icky. And the well was also in a pasture. And so I'm sure it had coliforms in it most of the time, if not E. coli. So it wasn't safe, but that's what I grew up on. And my dad always swore it was the best water in the world because it didn't have chemicals in it like the cities put in their water supplies. And that's the rural attitude. It's just dead wrong. And so yeah, you really have to understand your well, type of well, when it was put in, whether it meets code. There's certainly no grout, no surface protection for the well I grew up on. I came home one weekend while I was in college and there were frogs in our well. And so my dad's solution was to get a chimney rod and try to gig them out rather than do anything else. So it's really about understanding what your risks are and trying to protect your family and all those things. So here's two examples. The first picture is from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They have a blog where they put information out about wells and trying to support the citizens in their state. This is an article about a woman who stepped on that piece of plywood that was over top of that well, and she fell in and it killed her. And there's a lot of problems with this picture. You can see it's a jet pump that's up at the surface. There was a piece of concrete slab that was over top of that hole, but there's a siphon sitting there, or a funnel sitting there. There's an old broom in the corner. That looks like insulation all around the edges for this little building, where it's all, the insulation's gotten old and rotted and now it's laying on the ground. All that can fall in the well. It's just not a safe water supply. And in the end, it certainly cost her too by stepping on that plywood. And the picture on the right, that's a goat. Fell in a well. You know, we've ran across all kinds of things in wells. I was down in Southern Illinois and met Don Kelderman, and he ran across this at a house he'd been at. And, you know, there's nothing to say there other than, obviously, if a goat can get in your well, it's not protected at the surface, right? So, not to mention the amount of contamination that's definitely caused. And yeah. So what do you do with these wells? You need to try to bring them up to code if you can, and do what you can to protect the water quality, especially at the surface. So if it's a well in a pit, extend the pipe up to the surface, fill that hole in with clay grout, you know, install a pitless if you need to. You know, a pitless adapter was developed for cold climate where there's a frost line in the ground in the winter, so that you can run lines into your house and the well didn't have to come to the surface, and those pipes would freeze in the winter. So, you know, the well I grew up on had a little house, or a little brick house around it, but if we had to keep a heater in it all the time and heat tape on the pipes, and when our electricity went out one time for 7 days after an ice storm, our pipes froze and broke, and that's just the way it is. So, you know, it's worth making sure that there's no surface way into your well, and you know, talk to, there's folks at County Extension that'll help you, or your health department, or a contractor, or driller, about how to best go about that. So as far as abandoned wells, that's another issue. These are wells that are no longer in use, but they still exist. We hear all the time about people falling in them, or livestock falling in them. And because well logs weren't required in most states until at least the 60s, there are probably as many undocumented wells that are abandoned and not in use as there are wells in use in every state. You find them all the time. And so, you know, in some states, they didn't require well logs be filed until close to 2000. And so in those states, probably 90% of the wells, even in use, aren't recorded by the state agency there. So they're really like a well in a pit. You know, they're likely not upkept, so they're not protected at the surface. They can be a safety hazard as well as a source of contamination. We even find where people see, well, there's this old hole in the ground, I can just dump stuff there, and it may go right to an aquifer that you're using for your water supply. So the best thing to do is to fill them in and properly abandon the well, so that, and I mean fill it in with clay and concrete and gravel the way it's specified in your well regulations for your state. And if your state doesn't have well regulations, there are a couple that don't, then use some other state's regulations. Illinois has a good regulation on how to abandon wells. And we actually have a video on our website where McLean, or not McLean, oh boy, well, a town of about 16,000 in Illinois, we got called by a geology professor who said, hey, you know, one of my colleagues bought this house. It's 4 blocks from downtown, from the town square, and there's an old brick well in their backyard, and it's actually right against the house, and no one knew it was there. It was only 22 foot deep. So working with the county health department and the Groundwater Guardians group in that area, Macomb, Illinois, boy, I was losing my mind there. We staged an event where a driller came and properly abandoned the well. We recorded the entire thing. A number of local health departments sent their staff, and they got CEUs for it. And in the end, now we have a 5-minute video on our website on how to abandon one of these wells. And so, but they are a risk, just like the well with the goat in it. And, you know, these are also, these two pictures are from the Washington State Department of Ecology. And one here, they're trying to get a horse out of the well, and another one, a man fell 45 feet, it says. And if you read that article, it's from a number of years ago, but he was fine. He wasn't hurt at all. So very lucky. And these other newspaper clippings are all from the 90s. And the third one down is, those of you old enough to remember Jessica McClure. She fell in a well in Texas and was there for 18 hours, I think, or 24 hours, something like that. And they had to dig her out, and it was covered nationally on CNN and became a national story. These other three are all from different parts of Illinois. And back in the 90s, when, you know, everyone wasn't on the internet and on Twitter and Facebook and knew everything 2 seconds after it happened, the people in Galesburg probably didn't know about what happened in Buffalo Grove or that happened in Sangamon County. But people fall into these and die. And so if you have one, it's a risk to you as the landowner if someone were to fall in your old abandoned well that you haven't sealed. So that's what I have for the first part of this. I do want to talk a little bit about our program and what's available to you, both as a well owner and as someone who supports well owners. And the first thing really is our class. So it's a 10-lesson class. You sign up on our website with your email address, your first name, and what state you live in. And that's really so that we can provide to RCAP and EPA that we're covering the entire country. And then you get a lesson once a week at the same time as the time you signed up. Those 10 lessons. You're on your own to go through them. They're 6 to 10 pages each, and they provide you with a good basic course in being a well owner, and that's the idea. You'll know who you can contact, how to find information about your well, where you can get support, and basics about how water gets in your well, what type well type you have, and what that means, and what risks are associated with each kind. So you can go to Private Well Class and sign up. If this is our front page, when you go to privatewellclass.org, you click on Learn by Email on the bottom left over there, and that takes you to a page where you can sign up. For each of the lessons, there's also a bunch of resources we put together that were either used to help write the lessons, or some of the figures came out of these, but they're all about the same topic. So the first lesson is called The Science of Groundwater. It's really about what an aquifer is, what groundwater is, basics of hydrology, and how, you know, the different layers of geology in the soil, and all of those things that are we've tried to put this in a basic way so that, you know, that concept is there, and then you can move on. Lesson 2 is really more about contamination and how water flows through the ground and what the sources are and how to understand all those things. So there's a set of these documents that are freely available from other agencies for each of the 10 lessons. And we also do webinars like the one we're on today. Every webinar we do is recorded. So if you want to go back and look, you'll see at the end of this webinar today that we've answered the questions you all have asked. But the one we did 6 months ago with the same topic covered the information up till now that's the same. But once we get to the questions, they'll be the questions those people ask. And so if you go to, I don't know, we've done this particular webinar probably 8 or 10 times total, but the second half of every one of those has different questions that are valuable for you as a well owner to understand. And so we record every one. We did a webinar last August on lead, and we invited a guest speaker from Virginia Tech, where she's Kelsey Piper, who's done a boatload of work working with private wells and lead issues. And so she gave most of that presentation, and we've created a resource page to go along with it. So if you just go to privatewellclass.org/lead or go to the resource library page, you can see that. And it's got resources from EPA and public health and CDC, all those groups on what you need to do, even about filters. And, you know, there are some good filters that remove lead that work really well. And so if you're concerned about lead or you have lead pipes, first thing to do is test. Because if your water's not corrosive, lead pipes aren't a problem. Matter of fact, if water's not corrosive, a lot of times it's scale forming, which is the other side of the equation. and it forms a scale on the inside of those pipes, so the lead's not even touching the water anymore. And so, if you don't need it, it's an expense. So understanding your water quality and whether lead is actually leaching is the first thing to do. We also created, there's 16 training videos here. We're working on others. It's just, but they're on topics like what to do about a shared well. It's amazing how many people share a well with others and there's no paperwork involved. They don't know who the owner is. They don't have a plan for if a pump fails. It's a good way to have the person who owns the well say, you guys can go find your own well. Or when the property gets sold and it's a new person, they're not interested in being on a shared well. They may, there's just a lot of things. We recommend that you have an agreement, that you put money away, so that when a pump does fail, there's support there. And it really requires, it's like a small community action to do those things. So, but we get a lot of questions when there's problems with shared wells. One person doesn't have enough pressure, blah, 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 blah. And so if you're on one of those systems, you should know what your rights are, what rights you may not have that you think you have, all those sorts of issues. So for instance, another one is, why does my well keep losing pressure? Or how does my pressure tank work is a great one. A video we've created called How Does My Pressure Tank Work has had over 250,000 hits in, I want to say 3 years, less than 3 years. And it's just, what it tells us is there's not a lot of information out there about pressure tanks and how they work and how people can adjust that. And two, a lot of private well owners have problems with low pressure, which I'm sure some of you are nodding your head because it was an issue at my house when I was growing up, that's for sure. So trying to provide information through these training videos, they're only 4 to 6 minutes long, that give you a basic idea of one concept on one thing that maybe then you can take and deal with. We also have podcasts. We've developed, so far the first 3 lessons are 1, 2, and 3 there. The other 3, 4, 5, and 6 are actually from interviews that I've done with RFD Radio Network for Illinois Farm Bureau on different topics. But we hope to do the rest of our lessons at some point. It's amazing how much work a podcast is to actually put together for one of these lessons. So it's been slow to take off there. But I will say that we've had well over 2,000 downloads of our podcast, so people are interested, which is good to hear. We have an entire version of our class in Spanish, and this is the website. And if you email us, we can give you this information. But especially if you're a local health department or some practitioner that's in an area where there's a lot of native Spanish speakers, they can take the entire class in Spanish. You can send it to them. Oh, I thought I had more there. I'm sorry. I'm gonna go back. All 10 lessons, even the figures are all translated into Spanish. Not all of the videos we have of those 16 videos, but some of them have been done as well. And we were very fortunate because we're at the University of Illinois, and it's a world-class university that draws people from all over the world, that we were able to get a couple folks from Colombia who translated all of this into Spanish for us. So the goal of our program really, and all of this is, we want to help well owners understand why their well is important, why they really need to understand how it works to be able to protect themselves and their family from risk. That's the bottom line. And what we find, as I mentioned earlier, is there's really, it's not emerging contaminants like PFAS. It's not, that we detect things now down to the trillionth instead of the ppb. It's really well owners who don't understand what it means to be a well owner and what responsibilities they have, and it's poor well construction. Many older wells that are still in use that are a conduit for contamination because they're not protective at the surface and not properly maintained. And so if we get that message out, we'll cut down and folks change their behavior as far as how they deal with their well, and they do sample regularly, will make a huge difference nationally in how many people get sick from drinking water. And many places groundwater is perfectly fine the way it is. It doesn't need treated at all. It doesn't have any contaminants in it. But if you don't do all the right things as a well owner to ensure it stays that way, just like I'll show some pictures in a few minutes of wells where, it's just not a safe well because you can't predict whether a rat or a snake or something like that is going to get into a well, and then it'll be contaminated. And so, yeah, those are the basic concepts of what we're trying to do here. So now we're going to go to the submitted questions part of this, which we did get a lot of questions and we've answered a number of them. We can't answer them all, obviously, in the time we have today. But if you have a question and we don't get to it, you have two choices. One, well, you can email us and we can try to get back to you, or we will get back to you. Or you can ask the question in the question box or the chat box. And so, yeah, especially if there's something I've said today that you have a further question on, please feel free to submit there, and we will deal with those at the end. And if you're willing to stay, we're certainly willing to stay. And Jennifer's here to take those questions, and what she's going to do is compile them on a document that I'll be able to pull up at the end, and we'll just go through them one by one. And Dan will help me with those, especially if they're related to some of the water quality testing, sampling sort of things. So first question, I live in a farm area and worry about E. coli. How common is that in private wells are contaminated by livestock waste? So it's not necessarily that common, but anytime there's a source nearby, it's really good for you to be concerned and informed. So what that means basically is it occurs when there is livestock or nearby and your well is susceptible. So if you're getting your water from a shallow source, like you have a dug well, there's more of a risk. It doesn't mean it will, but there's certainly more of a risk because you're getting water from the water table. And you know, that's as water infiltrates into the ground. If you're really close, you know, to be honest, we did a dug and bored well study in Illinois back in the 90s where we went out and sampled nearly 100 hand dug and bored large diameter wells. And we ran across two that were in the middle of a feedlot, not in a pasture with livestock, but in a feedlot, 6 inches deep in mud, where cattle were standing right next to it and rubbing right against it. And, you know, why people don't understand that that's a risk, you know, I don't know. But understanding that and how close it is and where your water's coming from, certainly your local geology matters as well. If you're in a very sandy area where there's sand at the surface, water moves faster, so it could travel farther with bacteria in it. If it's a dug or bored well, I just mentioned what could happen there. Or if you're in a geology that's vulnerable, like karst, where it's, you know, karst is limestone that is susceptible to dissolution from water. So in southern Illinois and southern Indiana and Kentucky, like where Mammoth Cave are, where there's a lot of caves, those caves are where water started out in a crevice in bedrock and eventually wore out and made a giant hole so that it could travel. And it's from the melting of the glaciers, you know, hundreds of thousands of years ago. So if you're in karst topography, a lot of times you see sinkholes and people throw stuff in those. Well, that's a direct conduit to the water supply down there, and it's a series of caves and large fissures. Water moves freely like pipe flow. It can travel a long distance. So if you're in an area like karst, I know one of our counties in Illinois where they do have karst, 80% of the private well samples come back positive for coliform. And you know, that's strictly because there's so many sources at the surface that can get directly into the aquifer. So you need to understand if you have a deeper well that's got, you know, if you have a 200-foot well that's got 150 feet of casing, you know, depending on the geology, but it's much less likely that you'd have surface influence as long as the well's properly sealed at the surface. So the best thing to do is just to understand your situation, because everyone, like I said, everyone is different in the end. Every well's a little different in the way it's constructed or the type of material, all those things. Is bacterial contamination of a well caused by casing or grout leaks or from natural flow paths through soil and unsaturated zone? Really, the answer is both. And again, every well is different. And I'm going to spend a little time on this because, you know, there's a lot of issues related to bacteria, and that's the big concern. But you need to understand every situation is specific. So it requires a source nearby, or if it's an improperly constructed well, or if it's very vulnerable geology. So for a shallow well, if you have a dug well, an old hand dug well, I'll use the example where I grew up. It's just, they dug a big hole 14 feet deep. They lined it with bricks, but didn't cement those. So water could come in between the bricks. So that means water from 2 feet below ground surface can get in that well. And it was in a pasture where we had cattle and sheep. And it was also, the location was in the bottom of a ravine so that water would run through there. My grandpa at the time thought if we put it in the ravine, every time it rains, that well's going to fill up. And so that's our water supply, not understanding the water quality side of that. The other issue with the shallow wells, we see a lot of sand points in areas where there's sand at the surface and the water table shallow. They're driven in with a hammer. Typically, there's no grout, there's no protection, there's no borehole. So it may only be 10 or 15 feet deep. And if I pour water on the ground in sand, it runs right through it, right? Until, unless the sand's dry and it stays in the pore spaces and all that stuff. But every time it rains in a sandy surface and sandy soil environment, water infiltrates in and pushes down through to the water table or the aquifer. So in those cases, a shallow well is going to be much more likely to get contaminated just because of the type of well and the protection that's not there. We have a sand and gravel aquifer that's all the way to the surface along the Illinois River. And in that county, we see a lot of sand points because the water table can be as shallow as 4 feet. What I tell well owners is that there's 100 feet of sand there and it's almost all completely saturated. Even though it costs a little more, I'm putting my well down at 100 feet and I'm using a screen. So the way a screened sand and gravel well works is it's solid casing until you reach the screen. And in most cases, those are 4 or 5 foot screens. So water has to travel 95 feet to get to the screen to get in the well from the surface. And going through, sand is a natural filter. So it's much safer pulling your water from the bottom of that aquifer than it is from near the top. And that's just the way it is. So again, vulnerable geology, I talked about highly permeable soils. That's the sandy aquifers I just mentioned. And karst geology, I think I've already covered that as well. You see sinkholes, people fill those in with trash or dump stuff in them, not understanding that that is going right into their water supply. And water travels fast through those large fissures. So if you're in a vulnerable geology, like along a creek bottom, I know that's one of the questions I think today, you're likely that it's going to be influenced and not properly sealed at the surface. So it could be a cracked casing, you don't even know it. I always tell people you should inspect your well every year near the top, make sure that your gasket's not brittle and not sealing anymore, make sure the vent tube, if you have one, has a screen on it, all those things. One of the RCAP folks contacted me and said, we can't figure out what's going on with this well. It's right in the middle of the yard, there's nothing around it, and it keeps coming back positive for coliform even though we've disinfected it. Well, they sent me a picture, and sure enough, right 2 feet away from the well is an 18-inch diameter tree, and it's a PVC casing. And so what we figured out is that as that tree grew, it got into the annulus, which is the borehole outside of where the casing is, and eventually as that root kept getting bigger and bigger, it squeezed the casing until it cracked. And tree roots have a lot of bacteria and bugs and everything else associated with them. And so they really need to move the well or get rid of the tree and reline that top part of the well so that it's sealed again because there's a crack in the casing. And I want to mention the Nebraska grout study because the state of Nebraska did a study, I don't know, 15 years ago or so. You can look it up if you just Google Nebraska grout study, you'll find the information where they showed using clear plastic piping so they could camera everything. When they put grout in certain geologies, it did not stay in the borehole. So even though, state construction code requires certain kinds of grout, liquid grout, or whatever it might require, in certain geologies, that grout won't stay there. So now you've got a conduit around the outside of the well down to where, down to the aquifer. And so it's ironic, No state but Nebraska has changed their well construction code because of that work. But I just talked to someone, I believe in New Mexico, they're rewriting the regs because of that. So that in New Mexico, in certain types of geology, you have to use different kinds of grout. And I know one of the conclusions was natural bentonite chips is probably the best way to seal a well, which isn't that practical for a lot of applications. So, and the other part about your well is no sanitary cap. Bugs, rats, frogs, rabbits, goats. We've talked about that. Many examples. This well on the top here is a well we sampled for our Duggan Board well study. Those posts on the top left, those posts are all worn because that's a cattle pasture and the cattle come up and rub. And you can see on the bottom right where it's kind of muddy, that's because I think there's a hydrant near there and a water tank out of the picture. And so that water, the cattle are stepping there. But this is a big, large diameter well, hand dug, I'm sure, that's on a slope in a pasture with a cornfield, I'm sure in some years above it. And it's covered with pieces of 2x6s and tin and covered with blocks. Snakes, everything else can get in that well. And there's no way that that's protective, especially the cattle are right there, and stuff's infiltrating in the ground right there, and it's a shallow well. The one on the upper left, this actually is not a dug well, even though it looks like it. There's actually a 3-inch casing down there, but it's in this pit. And so, and it's from the 40s, the well is. So it's not properly sealed. The well cap hasn't been changed forever. And we had to dig all the weeds out around this just to get to this well. And first thing the dog did was jump down in there and start chasing the mice that were in the thing. It's just not a safe way to go. And, I already showed you the goat picture, but the picture on the bottom left is a well. Jesse Campbell is one of the RCAP staff in the MAP region, which is in the plains. And he's provided me with a ton of pictures, but this is a great example of these folks. Somebody, a mower or something came by and busted this casing, and they've just left it this way. And you can see that, having a casing that's only an inch above ground surface, and dirt can get kicked in, all kinds of things, mice can fall in. It's just not a safe well in that respect. So you shouldn't have any of these kind of situations. Okay, so well disinfection. Is dropping a pool chlorination tablet into my well an effective way to rid coliform bacteria from my water system? What about pouring a gallon of bleach into my well? And there was more to that question, but that's the gist. And the bottom line is neither of these are the way to prevent bacteria in your well. The way to prevent bacteria in your well is to have it properly sealed at the surface and to understand what sources are around you and where your water's coming from. And, there are cases where you can't do anything about having coliform bacteria in your well. Some people are on springs, or they're on a shallow water supply. That's the only source there is, and it does have a connection to some source. And in those cases, the only thing you can do, if that's the case, you can disinfect, but it's going to come back because water is moving constantly in the ground. So if you have a continual source, and I'll use a spring for an example, because we see these a lot where there are springs, you have to add automatic treatment, which I didn't say here because I wasn't thinking that when I wrote this, but you have continuous treatment, either something to chlorinate your water continuously like a community does, or a UV system, ultraviolet light system, that kills all the bacteria as it comes into your home. And so the deal with these tablets, there used to be these they look like McDonald's coolers that you put on top of your well, and they're full of these tablets, and they drop one every so often. Most states no longer allow those because they really aren't effective. And so the idea of pouring bleach in your well as maintenance is not necessary or a good practice. One, it's hard on your well components. It causes your rubber seals to get brittle if you have a pitless, or on your pump. It's also an oxidant. So I said here, oxidant for bedrock wells, if there are any metals in the rock, like some metals that exist in bedrock in a natural material, it'll release them into the water. Or even if you have brass seals, or your pump has brass or lead at all, it's going to release some of that metal into your water. And the bottom line is you should only disinfect your well when it needs it. And that is, you determine that by sampling for bacteria and you have a positive result. Otherwise, there's no reason to chlorinate your well, ever. Okay. And I will take that back a little bit and say, we did talk earlier about anytime the well's opened, or there's a chance of a source being introduced, in those cases, then you should go ahead and disinfect just to be safe. So to follow up on that, then the next question was, once people discover they have E. coli or coliform in their well, what's the first thing they should do? So one, you should boil your water that you're going to use for drinking or cooking until you have it disinfected and your water system has been retested to confirm there's no more bacteria. So we went through probably 60 or 70 different documents that different organizations have put out about how to disinfect your well. And the one we felt was the most comprehensive, easiest to understand, and clear to use is from the Minnesota Department of Health. And this is what it looks like on top. Now, we started using this probably in 2013 or 14. And since then they've modified this, but we actually like the old one better. It has more detail and pictures. And so we still link to the old one. And you can get to that from our website under those class resources I showed earlier where it said lesson 1 and 2. Under lesson 10, you'll see one of the things listed there. Lesson 10 is called Water Treatment Solutions. And one of those is this well and water system disinfection. And so I do want to make a note. We just had a conference just for private well professionals in May. And there's this ongoing issue of when your water has a pH over 8, chlorine becomes less effective. In fact, over 8.5, I believe, it really doesn't disinfect at all. So you could add, 3 times the chlorine that's recommended, and you might still have bacteria problems because your pH is so high that the chlorine can't do its work. So I guess what we recommend initially is that you test for pH when you test your water, and especially if you have bacteria, you should test your pH. And all I can tell you is we're working on this with some other folks to try to come up with a solution we can give everyone when that happens, because there certainly are places in the country where the pH is over 8. And, chlorine disinfection may not be the best way to go. There are other options. I don't know enough about those, to be honest, using peroxide and some other things. One of the solutions that's recommended is to actually use some other something with a low pH to put in the water and create a lower pH for the water in your well. And I'm sure that works in some cases, but when you start mixing and everything else, it's just, we just need to learn more about it. So we're working on it, and that's where I'll leave that. But you can get to this document from our webpage, and it's great. It has pictures. It tells you why you don't pour straight chlorine into your well. You mix it so that it's not at such a concentration that's going to affect leaching of metals or from your plumbing or your pump or from bedrock, and how much you need to mix based on the type of well you have and all those things. It even has information about what to do with treatment if you have a water softener or filter. And a lot of the recommendations are to go to the Water Quality Association, WQA.org, where they have all the information for all the treatment vendors and the equipment they sell. And so you can call them as well, and they will help you understand whether it needs to be offline, whether you need to take the cartridge out first, or what you need to do to protect that equipment. You certainly don't want to ruin your treatment equipment by disinfecting your well. What's the minimum safe distance to keep livestock and farmland away from my private drinking water well? And does there need to be a set distance a board well needs to be from a natural spring or lake? We had several questions. I put these 2 up. We had several others in addition about distances. And most states have regulations and guidelines for new well construction. So they're required to be a setback based on whatever that state has decided. So they're different from state to state. In most states, again, 2 states don't have those that code, and that's Pennsylvania and Alaska. But in most cases, those are a good rule of thumb to use, and that's what's required by law. But in some cases, and not necessarily that many, it may not be adequate depending on the geology or how shallow the well is. And so if you're in an area where your geology may be considered vulnerable, or you're going to put in a shallow well, then I'd err on the side of caution, and I would also talk to your local health department and ask them if they feel that the setbacks they're going to use are sufficient. And so I just showed this as an example. It's one I've used in our class. It's a good visual of what Minnesota requires. And so you can see all the different things that could affect a private well and the distances they require. Some aren't that much, 20 feet from a kennel, to me, that's not very far, but that's, they've also got to compromise, I'm sure, to get a law passed in the first place. So these are minimum guidelines, and here's the bottom half of that. You can see even 3 feet from a building or building overhang, and that's really just a practical thing, so that if you need to have work done on your well, a rig can set up over it. You'd be surprised how many wells that we find they're in a basement, in a garage, or somewhere where it's not accessible even to open. And that's not the way to have a well. You shouldn't put a well in and then put a concrete slab over top of it so you can have a garage. And we've actually seen that happen. It just, your well is a valuable, it's a valuable part of your home. It's, it's like replacing a car if you have to do something to it. So you need to take care of it and make sure that it's put in a place that it can be protected. So well near my creek, my well is about 15 to 20 feet from a creek. Should I be concerned my well is under the influence of surface water? I would say that many times if you put a well that close to a creek in a bottom ground like that, it's because that's the only water source. We see all the time where somebody buys a property and their home's up on this bluff and they build it and they try to put a well in, there's no water. So they end up going down into the bottom ground behind their home, right along some small stream, and putting a well because there's sand there from the alluvial sand from the stream when it used to run, it was much bigger and wider, like when the glaciers were melting. And so there's a sand aquifer that's fairly shallow there. So there's a very good chance, the answer is yes, that well is shallow and connected to the shallow sand that's near the creek, which means it's connected to, in all likelihood, the creek itself. And so that said, if it happens to be a deeper well and it has solid casing through the shallow sand, then it may be tapping a different aquifer that's protected from that surface influence in the creek. And so, but if it's a large diameter well, a dug or bored well, then I would say it's most likely would be influenced. And so the thing to do there, let alone be concerned about flooding and the well being overtopped, but is you probably want to sample for coliform a little more frequently. If the water gets close to the well, you gotta remember that's infiltrating the ground, and every time you pump your well, you're lowering the water level in the well, and that's drawing water in from all around. And so it doesn't actually have to reach your well at the surface to be influencing your well, the water coming in your well. So it's, in some of those cases, it may be that every time you sample, you have coliform problems or some kind of bacteria issue. And if that's the case, then probably the safest thing to do is to add continuous disinfection, which would mean a chlorinator in your home or a UV system. And again, I mentioned springs. This is almost the same, not quite, because it's just too influenced by the water level in the creek and what's happening there. And Dan, are you back with us?
Yeah, right here, Steve.
All right. Well, this is about water softeners, and I know this is your Bailiwick. Matter of fact, I think these might be your samples, right?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, we get the question, once in a while about how to make sure my water softener is working. I thought it'd be a good idea to just talk about primarily what the water softener does. It's an ion exchange process. It exchanges calcium and magnesium primarily for sodium. anything that's positively charged, but and is attracted to this resin. Hardness is calculated from calcium and magnesium, and we've got some analysis here. I guess, yeah, it's best to use a lab. Another point here, it's best to use a lab, but a lot of times if you're in for a quick test, you can get these hardness tests at pool and pet stores and hardware stores, the little strips, so you can do it yourself. You can also usually tell if you're used to soft water, when the salt runs out, it'll feel different. Like the soap it'll be slipperier, it'll be more slippery, things like that. But here's an analysis that shows what's going on with a before and after a softener. The first sample has a lot of iron in it, and it has calcium and magnesium in it that are pretty high. It's got some sodium in it too. That's pretty average for the water around our area and really a lot of Illinois. And so then after the softener, which is the sample to the right, the iron's gone almost completely. The manganese, there wasn't much there initially, but it's gone. And the calcium and magnesium, this is pretty typical. They're usually reduced by the softener down to less than 1 part per million. So that's going to give a hardness value of, usually hardness values will be less than 10, probably less than 5 parts per million as calcium carbonate. And you'll notice that the sodium is going to increase. That's typical with the sodium chloride softener. They also sell potassium chloride for people who are on low sodium diets. You can make an estimate of how much sodium is going to be put back in the water. If you have the hardness, the factor that people often use or sometimes use is 0.46. So I just like to think of it about half. So if your hardness, say, was 200 parts per million as calcium carbonate, you can expect a sodium increase of about 100 parts per million.
That's about right on, isn't it? Yeah.
I didn't even look. Is that right?
Yeah, 350.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is sure. It's pretty typical. Most people with softeners and fairly hard water, which is pretty common, are going to see an increase of sodium of a couple hundred parts per million.
All right. Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can try this one too. It's related, sort of related. I mean, basically, somebody was asking about high iron. Is the high iron unhealthy, and how do you reduce iron in the well water? Iron's not really considered unhealthy. It's part of a good diet, but it is probably, from the calls we get, it's probably the largest call we get. Something to do with iron staining in some form, iron or iron bacteria, something like that. Usually just iron staining, and how can I get rid of this iron? Iron can exist in water in an oxidized form or a reduced form. Basically, it's a dissolved, or the stuff when you think of iron, you see this brown, the water turn brown. Usually it won't be brown right out of the ground. It'll look clear, like if you run an outside hose or some untreated hose, it'll run clear, and you fill up a bucket and it sits overnight. It will turn brown because the iron's oxidizing to the iron 3 form from the iron 2 form, and that the iron 3 form is insoluble, so it starts to fall out of solution. So if some of that's happening ahead of time, what I would do is start with a sediment filter. It should, if you go down to like 5 microns, it should remove any of this oxidized iron that's already fallen out of solution. You might be able to get buy with a larger micron. I've got a well, I use a 5 micron filter on my well, and it seems to work. I mean, I get a lot of black sediment on my filters. But then I would, then you can add a treatment device to get rid of the rest of the dissolved iron. Often we see a lot of samples where people just use a softener alone, and that's enough. Usually it'll get most of the iron out. I know they sell softeners that are rated for different levels of iron, so I would get a softener that's, first of all, rated for well water, not just municipal water that's already been treated and doesn't usually have much iron. So I would get a better quality softener, and they'll sometimes have settings on them. And I would actually, when you set it up, I would do a little bit overkill at least. If you've got 5 parts per million, set it for 7 parts per million of iron. If you don't want soft water, if you use a softener, you're going to get soft water also. So if you don't want that, then you can try just an iron filter. Or if you have so much iron that a softener is not going to work, you can also try an iron filter there. Usually what's involved there, if it's an aeration thing or if it's a green sand, something that's what's going on in most of these, as far as I understand it, there might be things out there that I am not familiar with, but usually it's oxidizing the iron through some process and then having a filter to remove it. So you're left with stuff, essentially all the iron's been converted to iron 3 and then filtered out. And yes, Steve, it's got a good link here. The Illinois Department of Public Health, I'm sure there's lots of good resources, but when I turn to, we're in Illinois, and I often turn to the Illinois Department of Public Health's website. Like Steve put here, Google iron in drinking water, and they've got some good resources about, I think, different treatment types and things to look for.
So yeah, okay. I checked all these out. So Dan, you provided me this link.
Okay.
I went in and Googled iron in drinking water, and it's like the second or third hit in Google. And so I went ahead and if I can get this to work here.
It might be in the next slide, right?
Yeah. This is what that page looks like. And it does have a lot of good information. It walks you through what you need to think about related to treatment, what you need to know. So, yeah.
Yeah, so most of the treatment's probably doing a similar thing, and I didn't really want to single out one. I mean, I guess I talked about a softener, but that was sort of just because it's pretty common.
Yeah.
But
okay, thank you.
Sure.
We also had a question about manganese. Really, what it comes down to is I think for a long time, folks didn't realize that manganese is actually dangerous in water, or does have toxic levels. And so, you know, I believe my boss, Walt Kelly, provided the answer to this. But there is growing evidence that manganese may be toxic. And so the best thing to do here is, again, I Googled this, and it's the third or fourth link, manganese in drinking water. If you just Google that term, the Minnesota link comes up, and it's a web page, and then you can see this PDF and download the information. And they've got a lot of good resources there related to what it causes and why you do need to know the manganese values in your drinking water. And this one, you know, we get radon's an interesting thing. So explain radon in water testing. Why is it necessary when you can test radon in the air in the house? And again, Walt Kelly provided a response to this. And really, it is an inhalation issue, but EPA on their website has information that shows that, and I meant to have this in quotes, the second paragraph here where it says, EPA estimates that radon in drinking water causes about 168 cancer deaths a year, 89% from lung cancer caused by breathing radon released to the indoor air from water, and 11% from stomach cancer caused by consuming water containing radon. And so EPA has a website that explains all this better. We don't, you don't test for radon, correct, Dan?
Yeah, and I usually take the same approach, Steve. I don't really try to address it because I'm not really an expert at it. I usually just refer to what the EPA talks about, because usually I see it referenced as an inhalation issue rather than the water issue, but it's not unheard of in the water issues.
No, and it's clear EPA has found information that suggests, you know, it does matter, especially if it's fairly high. And so what we created, here's that page. So if you just Google, radon in drinking water, this EPA archive page called Basic Information About Radon in Drinking Water is the first or second link. And so if you go down this page, it answers all of those questions that are there, and it gives you a good overview of you know, what you need to be concerned about as far as drinking water goes, because it is an issue. So yeah. So this is the last slide, I think, and I wanted to save it for last because it's, you know, we had several people who have said, I'm new to having a well. What should I know or consider? I just bought a home. What info exists and where regarding my well? What can I find? And so there's a lot to that, honestly. Understanding what department in your state or your county or local agency may house your well logs, how to understand the geology and who to talk to about the geology that may be different in different states. And so really the first thing to do is to take our class. And I'm not trying to be self-promoting, but it walks you through all the basic information you need to understand about your well. And you know, we've had I think over 7,000 people take our class around the country, and all we've got is positive feedback. It really gives you a start on what roads to go down, who you can talk to, and where locally you might be able to find information. Because in the end, we're based in Champaign, Illinois, and I certainly know a lot about Illinois groundwater, but I don't know a lot about groundwater and the specifics of it, as well as folks who live in your area that aren't in Illinois. And so really it's the idea behind this program, as I mentioned before, is to give you the tools so you're asking better questions. You understand enough about your well to know that, yeah, I've got an old dug well, I realize that's gonna be a problem, or I've got a bedrock well and it's 600 feet deep, but I only have 40 feet of casing. Why is that? There's a lot of those kind of issues. And I think the place to start is by taking the class. It's some effort. It's nearly 80 pages, I believe, in the end. But if you go through the entire thing, then we are more than happy to be here as a resource. We have folks contact us all the time who've gone through our class or even who haven't and have questions, and we try to help them find the information they're looking for, and that's part of our job. So, but in general, it really is, you should go through the class, and once you've done that, trust me, you'll understand your well better, the type of well you have, what your options are, and where you can go for help. And again, if anyone wants contact information for any of the RCAP regions, you can email us. And yeah, I think that's what I have there. So don't leave, because I'm going to see if we have questions. I haven't looked at that. It looks like we do. So what I'm going to do is exit out of the webinar and pull up this page. Hopefully everybody can see that. And I'm going to blow it up a little bit. I have to move this down. There we go. And we're going to go through what's here. So, do I need a pressure tank to get my water, or just a pressure pump? What's the recommended to pump drinking water through my home for my well? How do I ensure pressure? So it used to be that everyone used a pressure tank. So your well was set up to only run when the pressure got to a certain level. So the way that's set up is there's a gauge, you have a high end and a low end, and whenever it pumps water from your well into the pressure tank, when the pressure tank reaches a certain pressure, like 60 psi, then it shuts off, and then your pressure tank pushes the water through your home. And whenever the pressure gets down to, say, 30, sometimes 40, depending on what you have it set at, then that kicks the pump and the well back on to fill it back up again. And so, but these days they're coming up with, I can't think of the term, but they're pumps that are meant to basically come on whenever you need water, and they're constant pressure. So they will turn on, we see these days pressure tanks that are only 1 or 2 gallons, and that's just to get things started. And so they run faster or slower depending on how much water you're using. And so I think you still need one of those small tanks, and I'm not a contractor. I don't install pumping equipment, and neither does Dan or Jennifer, but that's probably a question for a contractor. But I do know these days that people are going away from the large pressure tank unless they need it for storage. So hopefully that answers your question. I can't remember what the term is for those pumps.
Is it just called variable speed, Steve?
It's a variable speed drive. That's what it is. Yep. And so they run, depending on how much water is being used, they run to maintain a constant pressure all the time. And so it shuts off when there's no water running. And when water is running, they're turning on, either they're not pumping very fast, or they're not pumping, they're pumping a lot, depending on how much water is being used, so that in the end, the pressure is maintained at a constant pressure throughout the home all the time. Where with a pressure tank, you go from, like, if you have it set at 60 and 30, when you first turn on water after it's up at 60, you're getting 60 pounds of pressure, and the pump doesn't kick back on until you're down at 30. So your water pressure goes to half of what it was before your pump might kick on again. So Um, okay, so should I be using chlorine tablets? And if not, what should I be using to clean and soften? Well, chlorine tablets don't soften your water, do
Yeah,
they?
it sounds like a two questions built in one. Like the chlorine is probably gets to something you probably covered earlier about should I
Right.
disinfect the well? So if it's a disinfection issue, I basically whatever was covered already.
Well, and yeah, and the bottom line is you don't need to add chlorine tablets to clean your well. That's not
Oh
how
yeah,
it's work.
yeah,
You only disinfect your well when you have a problem. Your well's not meant to have chlorine added all the time. So you shouldn't be using chlorine tablets in your well. And to soften your water, you use a softener.
yeah.
So
And typically in the softener, it's going to be regenerated with sodium chloride. I don't know what percentages are, but most people will use sodium chloride. But there are potassium chloride pellets you can buy too. I think the difference is like where it's like 4 times the price for potassium chloride pellets. I mean, shop around your local area, but I think that's the main difference. I mean, and there's health differences. Talk to your doctor if there's differences with, as far as sodium and potassium intake.
yeah. Okay, so it says, can you show or say the URL for the drinking water results site again? I'm not sure which. There were 3 different ones that we showed, I believe. Oh, you're talking about the Be Well Informed tool. There you go. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, sorry. Right. That is it. And if you just search Be Well Informed or New Hampshire Be Well Informed, it'll come up. So, yeah. All right. And it is a great site. And they've, there's actually a video on our website. We held a conference in 2017 and we recorded all the presentations. And we had one of the developers from the Department of Environmental Services in New Hampshire come and give a presentation on this tool. And that's recorded under our 2017 conference. And you can watch the whole video about that tool and all that. And it's interesting because of our conference and his presentation, that's why there's 6 or 7 states building their own, because he offered the code since it was developed with federal dollars. So yeah, pretty cool stuff. We live in a frontier colonia in the Gila Wilderness, New Mexico, 300 feet from the river. Our wells, we have water 8 feet. We continue to 80 feet for the well. We have a pitless adapter on the well and a pressure tank. At first, the water quality was good. However, after a major flood, which did not overtop the well, we had orange water with a lot of TDS. The recharge rate remains normal. Later, we had another flood, I'm assuming, and our water was black. After another flood, the water went to the orange, and the recharge rate was about 20 minutes of water with 40 minutes of recharge. And I assume that means that you lost suction and had to wait 40 minutes for it to have enough water for you to pump again. The hot springs water comes out orange at the source and where it seeps out of the ground. I have an idea of what maybe happened, how to resolve this. Would a video log find if there is anything wrong with the casing or screen? Yeah, as I mentioned before, a major flood doesn't have to overtop the well per se. It could be that, it causes changes in pressure in the ground, so water flow may went a different direction. It may be something that clears itself up over time if, if you don't have any more major events with the river. I don't know, has the water been tested? Wouldn't you assume, Dan, that the orange and the black are because of iron and manganese issues?
Probably something like that. I know I've had some black residue that's been ironed before. I suppose it would be more of the experience, what local experiences, like if health department knows or other professional contractors in the area know what the water quality normally would be like. If you're in an area with high iron, and manganese. I would certainly guess those first. Um,
Yeah,
I'm not sure what to say. What to say.
well, and you're in New Mexico, you said. So if you'll contact us and if you email us, our email is probably at the bottom here at info@privatewellclass.org. We can certainly also, if you're interested, get you in touch with the folks at RCAC, the Western RCAP, and see if they have someone who might be able to work on this with you. And if you have other information, like if you've had a sample done, yeah.
And if part of the question, Steve, was part of it like if the source water, if it's coming out of the ground orange, like that sounds like to me if it's before the casing, so it doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with the casing or anything.
Oh no, I don't think there's anything wrong with the well. I think it's the flooding caused,
Yeah.
a change in flow direction. So water from the hot springs has somehow got into the aquifer, or I need to see the geology. Are we talking bedrock here? I assume we are. Or is it sand and gravel that makes a difference? I think it almost has to be bedrock, though, for something like that to be the. So as far as will a video log find if there's anything wrong with the casing or screen, I don't think it's the casing or screen at all. And, it wouldn't be that something with the casing or screen is now causing that orange or black. It's got to be, because of the flooding, it's changed the chemistry of the water and it's caused some of that precipitate, the orange color and the black color that you wouldn't normally have seen. But, there's certainly a lot more information we'd need to get into that, I think. Yeah, email us if you would, and we can try to follow up because I think, and I don't know how you feel about contacting the New Mexico folks, the state folks, but I know we can also reach out to them on your behalf if that'll help. Or privatewellclass.org. We have another site called wateroperator.org for small community water supplies, and we get confused sometimes. It's all good. Okay, so so information about well drillers licensing in Pennsylvania. Jennifer's provided a link here. And can you recommend a contractor? We really can't. Just like working for the state, like I do. We can't play favorites. I know contractors that I rely on and I call, but if a well owner asks for a contractor, I give them the list for Illinois. And, on wellowner.org, which is a site maintained by the National Groundwater Association, they list all the well drillers that are in their directory, and that's a good place to start. You can also look for your state association. I know in Illinois, it's called the Illinois Association of Groundwater Professionals, but in many states, it's the State Groundwater Association, and they'll have a list of members, contractors, that sort of thing. So, and that's your best bet. And the other thing about recommending a contractor is ask your neighbors. Find out who they use, who's been around longest, because picking a contractor is not a trivial thing. Just like in every profession, there's good and bad apples. And one thing I will tell you about this is if you hire a contractor, you make sure that you get a copy of the log. I run into so many people who say, well, the contractor gave me a log and I called him and he said I can't have it. That's ridiculous. And it's actually, if you have to sign a contract to have your well drilled or repaired, drilled, I guess, then you make sure in that contract it says, I get a copy of the well log, because there's no way they should keep that information from you. Sometimes in some areas, it's such a competitive business, they really keep those tight on their chest or tight under the vest, if you will, because they don't want to share information that might go to a competitor. But as a well owner, that's yours and you should have it. So, all right, I think that's it. We went 20 minutes over. I appreciate everyone who stayed. And if you're looking for CEUs, here's the information. And as it says here, CEs will be issued the last week of June, first week of July. That's Katie Buckley, who's our person who manages our CEU program, if you will, is gone until the 27th, but I'm sure she'll be right on that when she gets back. So thank you all for attending, and Dan and Jennifer for your help. And again,
Sure,
if you have
Steve.
any questions, you can email us at info@privatewellclass.org. All right, thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.